first hour, we talked a lot about self-sacrifice and the notion of selfishness and self. When you talked about self-sacrifice, you mentioned submitting to one to another. And I would like to have, what do you think the difference is between submission and surrendering?
Well, like we said, there are different types of self-sacrifice. There's pure virtuous self-sacrifice, and there's self-punishing, self-denial self-sacrifice. In many ways, you can say, I mean, again, there are different forms of this self-offering, different qualities of mind associated with it, right? So we can certainly use the words surrender and submission in relation to those two different types of self-sacrifice.
Yeah, they don't mean, yeah.
Again, any word can mean anything you want, right? We use the word red for certain qualities of light. We could just as well use the word green if we wanted, but we don't. So we can use the word surrender to associate with virtuous self-sacrifice, or virtuous, wise, and wholesome, skillful self-offering. Surrendering to reality, surrender to what is, acceptance of the unacceptable. This is not the same thing as submission to domination, which is very much what's involved in the other form or other type of self-sacrifice, which is self-abnegation, self-negation, self-denial, self-rejection, self-punishment, masochism even. So again, in a situation that involves limited self-benefit or any imbalance of giving and receiving, where the giving predominates or would predominate if one chooses to do so, and very little can come back in return, right? The typical 80-20 relationship or situation. He, she can't give me much. He, she needs a lot. I'm okay. I don't need anything other than the act of giving. All I need from you is to receive, because you wish my help. So I get 20, or I get back from you appreciation, and I give you something valuable, and you give me, all you can do for me is appreciate it. Maybe the person can't even appreciate it. You don't even get appreciation. All you get is basically self-affirmation that you made the choice to offer something of benefit to the other in that situation, in which you got nothing back at all. All you got back was your acknowledgement that you did the right thing, or you think you did the right thing. At best, that is virtuous surrender to reality. In the case where you have no choice and you surrender or stop fighting, so surrender as wise acceptance and non-resistance, right? Resist ye not evil, maybe, said Jesus. Resist ye not evil, turn the other cheek, or put away the sword. Basically, some counseling to surrender to what is, because it's better than fighting what is, or better than dominating what is. Moving into domination or moving into hopelessness is no good, or moving to resistance isn't wise, but acceptance is the right way, or the best way, or the positive way, or the achieved way of learning and growth in the situation. That's a kind of surrender. It's a surrender to what is and what's best. And in some cases, self-sacrifice is the wise result of surrender to what is. Right? Again, the couple has a beautiful child, and the child gets sick, and the child is invalid for the rest of their life. Bang, that's all. They get a virus, they're sick, bang, they're invalid for the next 50 years, 40 years. That's it. Now, the parents can kill themselves, they can kill their child, they can run away, they can put them in an institution, or they can accept the reality and their sense of responsibility that they don't want to abandon their child, so they sacrifice themselves, actually, and maybe get back nothing. If the child can't talk, who knows what the situation is. That's a kind of surrender to reality, or to what seems right, doing the right thing, and it's a kind of self-sacrifice in the highest noble way of virtue. That's different than, if we want to use the word submission to authority, submission to being controlled, submission to the self-denying self-sacrifice that involves overriding or neglecting one's personal desires. So you can say, if you want, that surrendering to what is in the way of a virtuous self-sacrifice or self-offering is the positive path. And it's a path of self-love. In that situation, loving wisdom counsels surrendering to what is without resistance, and self-offering or self-sacrifice in which very little is received in return. Meanwhile, it's the right and the best way. Versus submission to authority, submission to command, self-denying self-sacrifice, in which we harbor and don't recognize self-blame, low self-value, some reluctance to honoring our desires, some unconscious, subtle self-dislike, self-disdain, that allowed us to be, that is the reason we put ourselves under the domination or control of some negative person who wants to exploit us anyway, who's teaching us this form of self-denying self-sacrifice. So we can define those words that way.
Yeah, when you were talking, I had these thoughts. Well, when you said that surrendering and submission are also, it depends of how we see these words, how we understand them. Because I was thinking about the concept of pride and humility. One, in my understanding, in the way I see things, I would say that someone who has a lot of pride might use the word submission or more often in a situation when a catalyst is coming to them, thinking, I'm not gonna surrender there because I don't want to submit because I'm not inferior.
Well, they're using it as an equivalency then.
Yeah,
Surrender, surrender equals submission.
Yeah.
Surrender to what is equals some kind of self-rejection or some kind of lowering of myself to another's will, to the will of another or something like that. Mm-hmm. Or to the, there's a saying, there's a poem, I think it's Frost, somebody, I forgot who, Dylan Thomas, rage against the dying of the light. Something about his father or an older man dying, fight against dying, don't die, you gotta stay alive, you gotta stay with it, don't give up. Which would be, in my understanding, an unwise rejection of the natural process of dying, or of unwillingness to surrender to the reality that it's time to go. Some people would think you must fight that, fight your disease, fight the cancer. Yeah. How do we fight cancer?
Yeah, as a proof of will.
Yeah, well, it's there. Some people have a very oppositional paradigm, or it's the oppositional conflictual paradigm of life. Life is a struggle. We've got to fight to win. If you don't fight to win, someone will fight and beat you down. Either, nice guys finish last. Self is first.
Yeah, if you don't take it, nobody will give it to you.
Right, you got to fight for everything you want, and that's life. And so, surrender or accepting what is without resistance equals defeat. Mm-hmm. You see, if surrender equals defeat, or submission equals permitted, allowed domination or exploitation, then the person never wants to accept anything. They want to fight everything, right? Because the point is control. And so the negative path is all about control. Mm-hmm. And that's the opposite of acceptance, right? Control and acceptance is the dichotomy between love and rejection, or love and non-acceptance. So love is acceptance, and control is the rejection of what is in favor of my imposing my will, my design on what is. So pride then is a form of control. I don't think we need to keep talking more about surrendering and submission, because they're just definitions, or they're just words that can mean anything. Yes. But there is wise acceptance of what is, and there's unwise self-abnegation or self-negation in surrender of one's autonomy to the domination of another person. Mm-hmm. That's a real defeat. Whether we call it submission or not, it's a defeat when you eviscerate your will, when you cut away your will. So when we talk about pride, what is pride? Where does it come from? Can it lead to healing?
Yes.
Essentially, the root of pride is the belief in separate self. Pride is a positive valuation given to the self. It's a positively valued sense of separate self. A positive valuation to the sense of separate self. I am smart, I am good, I am high, I'm a late 60 wonder, I'm awake, I'm not a sheeple, I'm great, I'm a good teacher, I have a nice mouth, I can form words nicely. Some kind of positively charged conceit. You see, in Buddhism it's called the self-conceit. The truth is anatta, meaning no self, or no solid, fixed, separate self. Reality equals anatta. Emptiness equals anatta. There is no self on atta, on atman, no self. One of the primary qualities, one of the three characteristics of phenomena, or mind, or non-enlightened mind, is anatta. It's dukkha, anicca, anatta, dukkha, right? Impermanence, no self, and emptiness, or insubstantiality, and dukkha, which is unsatisfactoriness. But the belief in separate self, or atta, the opposite of anatta, which is reality. Reality is anatta. Reality is the one ocean of life. There are waves, but the nature of the wave is just water. Its substance is water. Its form is distinct, right? So people are mistaking the form for its nature or substance. The substance of the wave is water. The form of the wave is distinct and separate. You are not your form. You are not the appearance of water. Water can be shaped into a wave. Water can be unshaped and still. And then there's no distinct, form. The water is unified in the body of water called the ocean, the one ocean of creation. When it forms into a wave, we call it body-mind-spirit complex. If the speaker, the one who speaks, the one who perceives, the perceiver, the one who is conscious. If the one who is conscious believes that it is the wave, it's called pride. The root of pride is identification with the form of the infinite. The form of the infinite is the wave. The form of the boundless is the wave. If you identify with the form of the infinite, which is the wave, which is body, mind, spirit complex, or body, or emotion, or mind, or social achievement, or position, or spiritual level, or spiritual achievement, spiritual accomplishment.
The story we are creating in this life. That's the attachment to this storyline. To this
any element of the storyline that is taken as identity is pride. Pride is taking an element of form, the storyline of mind or your naming activity, right? It's all naming activity. Any element of the naming activity, which is the storyline, which is a constituent of the form of the infinite, a constituent of the wave, body, mind, spirit, will, right? Unity, energy, consciousness, light, awareness. Any element or constituent of this form of the infinite, of the ocean of life, taken as a self, is pride. That's self-conceit, the self-conceit. Pride, belief in self is conceit. Conceit meaning a puffed up, reified, concretized belief in a separate identity that is then positively charged or given a positive valuation.
Can we say that this belief in a character that we built with our storyline, with many things, can we say that believing so strongly in this character, we are actually limiting ourselves?
Of course, sure.
Because we become, well, we think we are just this wave instead of the ocean.
Yes, of course. Well, identification is a form of limitation of self-recognition. Any identity is a limited recognition of one's true nature, whatever that is, right? We can say, I am infinity. That's our true nature, actually. Anything less than that is ultimately an identification with a reified concept, right? Some portion of the naming activity. What are you beyond your naming activity, right? Beyond belief in your storyline, beyond production of your storyline, what are you? I remember I had this insight when I was 18. I remember the night very well. I was in my room in the dorm in meditation in Oberlin, Ohio, 1980 or something, 81. And I'm sitting and there's candlelight or something and it's late and I'm meditating and it hit me. Self is just a thought. Self is just a thought. Now, that's a thought too, right? That's a thought also. Self is a thought. But that's a thought that came from gnosis, that came from realization, that came from a little insight that, what I believe myself to be represents a continuity of thinking. When the continuity of thinking ceases, and there isn't belief, there isn't production of the continuity of thinking, there isn't thinking, then there isn't a self, not a separate self. There's not a fixed conceptual identity. Who is speaking? Is my finger speaking? Is the mouth speaking? Is the brain speaking? Cut my brain. It'll maybe still speaking, maybe not. What happened? Where did it go? I don't know. Who's speaking? Who are you? Right? Who are you? Nobody can answer that, actually. I mean, I am that I am is the answer, or tatvamasi, or it's unutterable. It's beyond the naming activity. So yes, of course, any identity, any self-identification, which is the root of pride, is itself a limitation of self-recognition and a limitation of the capacity of our being, or our capacity, whatever that is, whatever it truly is certainly limited by any kind of conceptual identification.
So it's also the roots of sickness.
Absolutely.
I mean, in a way, when people say, I have a cancer, or I'm a mother, they're limiting themselves to this role or to this thing that they have.
Yeah. Well, any self-identification is a limitation.
So the fact that they believe in that, as long as they keep their belief, they cannot heal from a disease, for example.
Well,
if they could stop believing I have a cancer, but not just by forcing themselves, but if they could stop thinking I have a cancer or I had a cancer and I'm a person that survived from that. If they could, if they could see the emptiness of their story line, I mean, for any kind of life.
Well, I don't think it's that simple. Recognizing self is just a thought doesn't heal lower chakra blockage. Okay? It doesn't necessarily change physiology in any great way. It can lead to great healing, but it's an initial break in the curtain of continuously believed thought, continuously trusted identification with thought and concept. So if the person, you see, what really is needed for healing is strengthened self-love, affirmation of self-love, and acceptance and responsibility for the illness. The person has to strengthen their sense of love for what they are. Now, love is not emptiness. Love is 4th chakra. Emptiness is more of a 6th, 7th chakra. Freedom from belief in consciousness, actually. So it's that kind of seeing through it is higher than love. Although, the basis of creation is love. So it's a little subtle there. But 4th chakra love is what's necessary for physical healing. There can be great self-love generated and the person still dies of their disease. But they don't take their body. You take your mind. So the great self-love that you could say was not enough to heal their body, they died of their disease, but they developed great self-love. That great self-love goes with them when they go off out of body. And that's a great achievement. So it's not realization of emptiness or no self or seeing through your storyline per se that does healing. It's actually tangible self-loving care, and that demonstrated in action, which is the tangibility of it, and taking responsibility for the situation rather than saying, oh, he did it to me, or it's my genetics, they did it. It's fickle fate or evil creator or just that genetic thing, just that chemical thing. The person would have to take responsibility for the genesis of the disease. So you have to put the first things first, Normally, disease is associated with 2nd, 3rd chakra blockage. And the healing of that really is the clearance of 2nd, 3rd chakra blockage, which is done by greater love wisdom, mainly love. So pride then, is positively affected, false, limited self-identification. And Gautama said that it's the last klesha to go.
Yeah.
It's the last fault or trait or taint. It's the last mark on the spotless being to be washed away or dissolved and released. Because, for the 3rd stage adept, the non-returner, who's right about at the edge of, complete and perfect enlightenment, the only thing that they have is some kind of very, very subtle sense of identity. They don't believe in naming activity anymore. They don't believe in the products of mind, meaning they don't believe that thoughts about self are real. They know that what this being is not the thoughts that are produced in mind. The thoughts that are produced in mind and the perceptions of experience that are defined perceptions, which is further naming activity. I perceive emptiness, I perceive nothingness, I perceive neither perception nor non-perception. I perceive, the infinity of consciousness, the infinity of nothingness, the infinity of neither perception nor non-perception. These are the three higher trances in Buddhism. The infinity of consciousness, which is unity, infinity of nothingness, which is the opposite of that, and the infinity of neither perception nor non-perception. The hell is that? In those perceptions, there's still a reification that believes that there's perception. There's still the belief that there's perception occurring. There's still the discrete function that's determined to be called perception. There's still perception. Infinity is transperceptual. Enlightenment is transperceptual, meaning the nature, if we are truly one with all, and your true identity is the ocean of infinite life, love light, the source of love light even, it doesn't have a discrete function called perception. It simply is. Its true identity is not a discrete function of itself. Its total nature is its total identity. Its true identity is its total nature. So even in those high states of mind where there's a perception of infinity of consciousness or unity, or a perception of nothingness, or some even freedom from perception, there's still an acknowledgement of that state of mind. That acknowledgement is the only identity that being has. Their identity, their last little, very, very thin kind of membrane of sense of separation, the membrane, the final membrane of their sense of separation, their sense of self, their identity, their pride, is identification with these rarefied perceptions. When the person realizes that those perceptions are also a product of naming activity, they're released and they jump out and they're out of the octave. And then they're free from becoming, thirst for becoming. There's no more. First there's physical becoming, then there's mental becoming, then there's perceptual becoming, and the identifications of self associated with changed, rarefied perceptions. When the person realizes that even those rarefied perceptions are still being identified with, the person is still identifying itself as associated with those rarefied perceptions. When they realize that, they let go of that, they go out of the octave. I mean, I'm not there, so I can't exactly narrate it, but pride is ultimately the held belief in a separate identity, self as separative identity, some sense of me, right? Some sense of me. That has to be retained until it's dropped, and that is retained all the way up into the level of higher self, actually.
When you say it has to be retained, do you mean by that it's to protect the self, or at least to, if one doesn't have that sense of a little, like, I have to take care of myself, I have to go get some food, I have to, how can we associate these ideas with, I was thinking that maybe pride in some ways, not fully, but in some ways had some usefulness to one's being.
Well, people think that way. It's a little. I know what you're saying. There's a saying that you have to have a strong ego before you can have no ego.
Yeah, I heard you saying that.
That's a statement in transpersonal psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, relatively speaking, it's true, but since there is no ego to begin with, it's sort of folly to imagine I have to make a strong ego first. You see, there's no raw set, that there is no such thing as ego. It's just a concept associated with third chakra blockage. Okay? We find this concept unworkable and understanding cannot come from it. This concept, ego is a concept. Not only is it a concept, meaning a thought, it's not a real substantive thing. It's a thought. Self is just a thought. And it's unworkable, meaning you can't work it to get understanding. Understanding cannot come from it, meaning fourth density activation cannot come from working with and developing the belief in the concept of an ego. However, before complete and perfect enlightenment, all the way up through higher self, through bodhisattva, higher self, perfect blend of love, wisdom, late sixth density, Atman, still has a sense of self. It's identified with the infinity of consciousness.
So we could say it's about having a strong sense of self.
No,
idea
it's love. If you love what you are, you don't know what you are, but you can love what you are. You can like what you are. Even some part of you is a asshole. You could still like yourself, right? Sometimes I'm an asshole and I regret it. I wish I wasn't, but I still like what I am. I don't really want to hurt people. I don't really want to be an asshole, but I basically don't want to hate myself either. That's not ego. That's not pride. That's love. That's self-acceptance. Now we're using the word self as a convenience, right? Referring to the agent of the speaker.
Yeah.
So using the word self does not imply an ego. Does not necessitate the existence of an ego, right? We're just using it as a marker to indicate that the speaker is talking about itself. The one speaker, the one who is a speaker, is speaking about itself. That's why we use the term. Is speaking of its own, is self-reflected, is self-reflecting, or is reflected, or is internally focused. See, even internal, external has to fall away. All dualistic terms of inside, outside, self and other, high and low, past and present and future, and before and after, all of that stuff goes away in the awareness of non-duality. But as a convenience, we use the word self. But that doesn't mean that there's an ego. Okay? There's the body, mind, spirit complex. These are energy fields associated with the 7 rays. That's all. Right? Within the body, mind, spirit complex, no ego can be found. Ross said ego is akin to third chakra blockage. So it's not that I don't think you need a strong self, you need a strong ego before you can have a no ego. Because there is no ego and never has been. So to build up something that's not real, because you think that then later you can get rid of it, is folly. Rather, live in truth, which is this being is indefinable. Your true identity is still a mystery to you. Do you love or do you hate? Do you accept or do you reject? Right? Do you accept what you are? Do you appreciate what you are? Do you have gratitude for yourself, being as you are? Can you move out of self-hatred, self-blame, self-punishment, regret? Can you move out of all that stuff? If you can move out of that, you're on your way to freedom. If you can't move out of that, that's where you need to start paying attention to the positive value you get from self-punishment or self-hatred or self-rejection. Okay? There is no self, or what you are is beyond a self or a not self. What you are, your true being, your identity, is beyond an ego or a not ego. All those terms are useless, actually, but they're convenient, possibly. But then people get tripped up on them, and they think, oh, I have to develop a strong ego. There is no ego, so there's nothing to be strengthened, nor is there something to be eliminated. However, there is a true identity that we could identify, or we could realize and discover. But that's not to be found in the body-mind-spirit complex. It's simply the body-mind-spirit complex is a tool to help us discover our true identity, which cannot be known by naming activity. And only when there's freedom from naming activity can we come to our true beingness. And then there's the question of So the Buddha didn't say that pride is useful and that's why you got to keep it all the way to the end. It's simply that a false identity persists all the way until the final destruction of of the identification mechanism in the mind, of the mind that identifies by naming activity its identifier. The identifier, the speaker, identifies itself. A reflective definition.
Well,
Reflect the process of reflective definition, which is called identity, ceases only late in the game, beyond higher. That's what Ra doesn't know yet. That's where they're going. To say the law of one is fine, but the Buddha Gautama never spoke about unity, because it's simply a transitory stage in final awakening. Unity is simply the realization that counteracts the delusive belief in duality. Duality is an illusion. Likewise, unity is an illusion. The only thing that's real is infinity. But that can only be perceived way late in the game, in late sixth density, and some reflective definition, which is called identity, is maintained all the way up to that point. It's not that it's important or helpful, it's just it can't be ditched until the mind is very big and all sorts of other things are dispatched or detached from.
yeah, my vision was that it has some usefulness, like a cane for somebody who's walking and who's in trouble,
Sure.
break its leg and then need a cane, but of course it doesn't need to keep that cane. If he keeps that cane, that will be...
You see, the Buddha, Gautama, said that all of his teachings were like a raft that we could use to cross the ocean of birth and death.
Yeah,
So the whole entirety of Buddhism is basically a temporary device to help infinity remember itself. Okay?
Yeah, not to stay attached to the device.
Correct. Yeah, it's not being attached to your medicine, and not because and many Chinese Zen teachers understood this, that if you take Buddha Dharma and Buddhism to be a thing to achieve and grasp onto, that'll be the cause of birth and death for you. Further cause of birth and death. And that's why they say if you see the Buddha in the road, kill him. And so it's the only religion where basically teachers are saying, if you see the founder, kill him, please. What it means is, it's symbolic. It means if you're attached to thoughts associated with the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha, and you make a big thing out of it, and you develop pride and egotism, so-called pride or arrogance or superiority belief from your practice involvement in Buddhism, you make more trouble for yourself. That's all. So then when we go to the counterpoint, humility,
yes, that's...
what is true humility? Where does it come from?
that was my question, yes.
Yeah, I have the same paper here.
Yeah.
Humility is the absence of pride, right? So humility comes from freedom from false identification, right? Humility is freedom from false identification. To say, I'm great, I'm a big shot, is normally called pride. Not only is it belief in a particular concept, right? I am identified with that condition of mind or condition of life status or body or something, right? I am a great strong man. I am a smart man. I am, the leader of the company of fools. That kind of identification, being pride, when it falls away, we find humility. When it falls away, true humility is certainly the absence of that, the false superiority associated with that limited identity or identification, sure. But humility is a word a little bit like, it's a little bit like modesty, which is normally defined in opposition to the quality that is that is being discouraged, that's being devalued, right? Humility is important because pride is bad. Modesty is important because arrogance is bad.
Yes, concept. Given by
Well, everything's concept. But what I'm saying is that the absence of a negative is itself not quite a positive.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, but it's not an entity of itself, right? Arrogance is a quality of mind. The absence of arrogance is quite nice, but it's not a thing, it's just an absence. So the absence of pride, if you understand humility as an absence of pride, it's normally it'll be a false humility.
Yeah.
If you understand modesty as the antidote to arrogance, it's normally a false modesty. And so because you're prescribing your virtue, you're defining your virtue in reference to a false negative, to yet another quality of mind that is based on nothing. It's based on illusion or ignorant perception. That's not the way to find a virtue. So, in my understanding, I've said, that a clear perception of one's relative achievement, one's level of relative development, one's relative level of development, is humility. Humility is seeing your position clearly, seeing your identity or your not really identity, but identity too. See, the only identity is your true identity. Every other identity is false. And that true identity is beyond naming activity. So you can't even name your true identity, right? Your true identity cannot be found by naming activity. Your true identity cannot be named. So every identity is a false identity, except that which cannot be named, which is beyond naming activity. It's surely beyond body or physical or mind or social or spiritual, beyond unity. So humility is a natural product of clear seeing. Clearly seeing what Ra said, your apparent distortions and absolute perfection. Ra was talking about the condition of mind of the meditator or the adept who's basically opening to creation and seeking unity, seeking enlightenment, freedom. That the person is aware of their apparent distortions and their absolute perfection. Their relative apparent distortions, their apparent relative distortions, and their absolute perfection. Complete and whole and perfect. All is one. So, aware of the relative and the absolute, aware of one's relative distortions in time and space, and one's true nature as being free from naming activity, or beyond any naming activity, or known only when there's freedom from naming activity. That kind of clear seeing of my personal distortions and the true being who is the speaker, that seeing leads to natural humility. Humility, like release or freedom, is a state that is the consequence of a particular achievement. It's like you can't say, let it go. Okay, let it go. But letting go, or having things gone, release, right? Release it. Release your anger. God, I'm releasing my anger. You can't release anger like that, but you can accept it fully in love and understanding. Then it releases itself. Release, like Buddhism, complete and perfect enlightenment is called release, actually, also. So there's ultimate release, and there's temporary or temporal, partial release, right? So release of false identity that leads to the recognition self is just a thought, or this sense of self is just a thought. My true self is beyond all naming activity, all thought. That realization came from something else. You can't get that, but you can create the conditions that lead to that. You can't make release. It's not like you're holding some anger in your hand and you're going to open your hand and it flies away. That doesn't happen with that. What happens is it goes naturally when you create the conditions needed for release. Or when you achieve or gain the perceptions of your true nature and your relative nature, your relative conditions of distortion and your absolute nature, somewhat, when you have those perceptions, humility comes naturally. And that is a lessened self-cherishing. There's much less self-cherishing. Because one basically, in terms of chakras, one is basically free from second, third chakra distortion or blockage significantly. One is living in universal love or caring or openness, truth, seeing, communication, knowing, fourth and fifth. When you're living 4 and 5, you don't want to personally identify. It just doesn't happen. It's considered stooping. In Yiddish, stooping means fucking, but I don't mean that kind of thing. Stooping is like you come into a room and the ceiling is low and you bend down. Continued belief to me, pride and arrogance. I mean, I could be called pride or arrogant, but I see who's above me. I see the guys above me. The guys above me, compared to the guys above me, I'm just a junior student. Nothing special at all. Nothing big at all. So I look ahead. I don't look behind only. I can see behind, but I can also see ahead. So when you look behind, you can say, oh, I'm a big shit because I'm smarter or I'm this or I'm that. When you look ahead, you say, oh, I'm not a big shit, I'm a little shit. Because these guys are bigger shit than me. Meaning, a logos. You think you're a big shit? Compare yourself to a logos. Compare yourself to Nityananda. Compare yourself to Gautama. Compare yourself to higher self. Now, if you know the reality of the higher dimensional community, pride doesn't arise. Pride doesn't matter. Pride is like a stooping. It's like a lowering and putting yourself into a little box and saying, I'm me and I'm good and I'm special and I'm better than you. That kind of shit doesn't even happen. You don't want it. It's the same thing with the non-materiality or non-materialism of a true sage or a true adept. They don't want the car. They don't want expensive stuff. They don't want it. They don't want you to follow them. They don't want an ashram or a sangha or followers or plaudits. They don't want it. They got something better already. So that kind of detachment from material grasping comes naturally when you have something better. Freedom from pride and arrogance comes naturally, and humility comes naturally when you have this perception of your relative status. Your relative and your absolute nature combined, both distortions and perfection, as well as who's behind you and who's in front of you, and what the higher dimensions look like and what the lower dimensions look like. When that is seen, humility arises, and it's not even humility, it's just simplicity.
Yeah, so humility cannot be bring on by education or whatever, because I see a lot of people using this word, especially in Asian culture.
Yeah, sure.
Saying pride is bad, so
Be
you
humble.
have to cultivate
Yeah.
humility.
Yeah.
And it's, for some people it's real, for some others it feels like it's more like a blanket, another blanket they put on themselves.
In general, it's not real. in general, it's an unhelpful antidote to the fear of people being arrogant and dominating. But actually, it normally serves a self-oppressive function. It's the same in Japan about gratitude. Gratitude is a great virtue, actually, but if it's legislated or conditioned into people, or forced, or demanded, or required, or commanded, it isn't real. It simply serves as a means of oppression and self-repression. And so you can't force humility, and you can't force gratitude. You can't force forgiveness. You can't force release. You can't force peace. But you can move the mind into seeing and acceptance. When the mind is directed towards acceptance, naturally a certain kind of edge of aggression goes away. When the mind is directed towards seeing, naturally false pride or prickly pride is smoothed, and what you call humility grows. But it isn't the humility of an enforced condition that the person wishes to be, or has been told to be, or is forcing themselves to be, or feels inferior to not be. What happens is people in Japan feel they're selfish if they don't say thank you all the time, showing gratitude. People here in Taiwan may feel selfish if they're saying what they want, or saying how they feel, giving their opinion, disagreeing, asking a question, making a comment. Anything that's a self-assertion could be considered selfish because it's not humble or proud, because it's not submissive. And that's the submissive,
Yes,
back to
yes.
submissive, which is then agreed subordination to the will of another. So they say you cannot legislate morality, right? You can't force people to be good. You can't also truly condition people to have humility and gratitude unless you explain the whole situation, right? So you can teach people what is pride and what is humility, what is arrogance and what is modesty, what is gratitude and what is ingratitude. You can teach these things, and people will then come to their virtues by themselves, actually. But like release, you can't make release, but you can make the conditions that lead to release, like detachment from patterns of anger or pride or sorrow or fear or self-blame. And again, always the solvent is love, wisdom. Solvent of all healing blockage is love, wisdom, self-acceptance or acceptance. And that's why being good to yourself is being good to the universe. Love in, love out. The love that's expressed for what we call self is love, if it's real. Acceptance and kindness and non-rejection, non-control, non-manipulation, non-judgment. If it is all that, although we can say it's directed to yourself, it's still a quality of mind, which is then shared in the ocean of all life. And so self-love is universal love, if it's true love. It's not pride, it's not arrogance, because there's no desire, there's no thought of superiority. We're not talking about that, we're talking about love. What is love? Acceptance, care, non-manipulation, honesty, right? You love yourself when you're honest about your experience. I feel sad. Okay. I can comfort myself in the reality of my feeling. That's love, and that's honesty. And that benefits all creation, because that's a little flicker of the light of love, wisdom. Or this patch of the ocean is now in the harmonious lattice, crystalline, orderly patterning of love wisdom, while before it was in the distortion of hatred.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank
Yes.
you very much for
So-
all your answers.
You're
Yeah, so we could
welcome.
say that all of this come down to the naming activities and definition we have of these words, in some ways.
Well, all human communication is based on a relative belief in naming activity. That's why Hinduism has a phrase that mind is the slayer of the real, and mind is the revealer. So body, mind, spirit. Mind is in some ways the creator of illusion, for sure, right? Meanwhile, through mind, we may remove illusion and perceive reality beyond naming activity. And that's transpersonal. The beginning of that is the transpersonal, which is love, wisdom, fourth, fifth ray.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.